Good evening. I'm Dr. Reginald Broadnax, editor of the A.M.E. Quarterly Review, and this is Practical Conversations, conversations for the life of the church. The life of the church includes not only its proclamation, but also the vibrancy of its people in the promotion and enhancement of the kingdom of God. Practical Conversations intends to engage conversations of practice and theology with persons currently working in the church at various levels and engaged in these issues. Our goal is to both inform and encourage those who are actively seeking to enhance God's kingdom through the use of their gifts. Tonight, our guest is the Reverend Dr. Richard Chapple, whose lead article in the upcoming edition of the Quarterly Review is entitled Julia Foote, a Brand Plucked from the Fire as 19th Century Self-Referential Writing. Dr. Betty Collier, in her book Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, argues that Reverend Foote is the first woman ordained in Black Methodism. But we know that the Protestant Methodist Church rescinded their ordination of a woman, and the Methodist Episcopal Church strictly forbade ordaining women. So, Reverend Foote, I argue, is the first woman ordained in Methodism. Dr. Chapple, in his article, examines Reverend Foote's autobiography, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, and gives us important insight both into her life and the struggles of a woman in ministry. Dr. Chapple, welcome to Practical Conversations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Broadnax. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you tonight. To our audience, if you have questions or comments, you can place those in the chat. I'll be able to see them and be able to address them as they come through. Dr. Chapple, it's so good to see you, sir.
It's good to see you, man. It's been a while. We've been doing this a while.
To our audience, we've been friends for a long time. It's so good to have you with us tonight and to be able to discuss your article, which leads our January edition of the Quarterly Review.
Great.
Give us a little insight on your interest in Reverend Foote and why you wanted to address that in an article for us.
Wow. Well, academics are always searching for something to write about. Number one, that's a given. I first heard mention, as I say in the article, I first heard mention of Julia Foote when Reverend Lula Williams, missionary supervisor Williams at the time, even as she is now, she made mention, I believe it was a book of sermons, The Daughters of Zion, which was quite a feat during the time, because as I remember, it was at that time that Zion clerics who were women were registering, even if silently, a barrage of complaints against the church for the inequities that they experienced. So I am programmed. My ontological being is programmed for those who have a minority voice or no voice. So I flagged her name at the time. Many years later, when doing some doctoral work in Methodist studies, had to read her book, Brand Plucked from the Fire. And so I gained intimate awareness of her then. Then in another course with Dr. Sharon Grant, who was at Hood, she assigned it. And I read it. And so I was just doing some reading, doing some research. And I came across a book. I'm getting ready to have a junior senior moment. I can't remember the book right now. But when I read the book, it seemed, as I recall, that, the very last chapter, the very last page, I saw this alluding to the fact that Julia Foote was buried in Brooklyn, Cypress Hill Cemetery. So look, I almost fell out of my chair at the time, because Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn is the cemetery where Mother Zion has its cemetery within their cemetery.
Wow.
And so a red flag went off immediately. I'm like, yo, she's buried in Mother Zion's cemetery. And, you know, I was pastoring there at the time. So the next morning, I made a call to the cemetery and they located her. They said, yes, she's here. She was buried in 1901. She's buried without a grave site. Come and see her whenever you want to. And I took my administrative assistant at the time. I took Pat. I took the chairperson of my trustee board. And we went out and we saw her. I was excited, got back home, called Dr. Grant, said, Dr. Grant, I have just fallen out of my chair because I just discovered that Julia Foote is buried in my church's cemetery without a grave marker. And so shortly thereafter, we purchased a grave marker, flagging her significance in the world of Methodism and certainly Black Methodism. Yay, she's in Mother Zion's cemetery.
And I think you mentioned in the article that not only is she in Mother Zion's cemetery, but she's buried in the family plot of Bishop Walters. Is that correct?
Yes, that is very, very true. She had he was very supportive of her. He recognized her gifts and graces, as we would say in Methodism. And though she was a very contested presence, and it's difficult to narrow one particular reason why she was a contested presence. She could have been contested because she was female. That's very much a profound part of the fact that people just didn't like that a woman and a woman like Julia Foote was in ministry. She was also a contested presence because she preached holiness. And you know, a form of British holiness and early colonial holiness may be a part of Methodist experience. But if you want to get us nervous, you start talking about holiness, especially holiness that might have a neo-Pentecostal or apostolic bent. Well, she was a die-hard holiness preacher, old school, prayer band kind of stuff. So she may have been a contested presence because of that. Now, I place this lens on it because in this modern age, we pay attention to aesthetics. And all of my sister girl friends in ministry will let me know that sometimes to the church's sinful nature, Julia Foote would have me allude to, sometimes due to the church's sinful nature, if a woman does not carry a certain kind of aesthetic, she is rejected more than she was embraced.
Okay.
All you have to do is at least look at the photographs that we have of Julia Foote, and you will see that perhaps her aesthetic was not pleasing to the day. So with all of those varieties of concerns, those kinds of issues that intersected, I just became interested in her story of protest. She was not a person who fit well within the matrix. Okay. And for me, in terms of what actually informs ontologically my attraction to her story, I'm not one who fits well within the matrix. So I found a kindred soul and was just interested in her story. And the more I read, the more interested I became.
Good. Well, we appreciate your concern and your passion for Reverend Foote. And the picture of her is on the screen now. You can see that she is a very, very stern-looking woman there with her. I'm not sure if that's a Bible or a book, but she's a very stern-looking woman.
Yes, despite the fact that she was married.
Yes. We'll talk about her husband, George, in a moment. But your article is entitled Self-Referential Writing. Tell us what that is and what's your methodology behind it.
Sure, sure. I was reading a book. My background is in rhetoric. I'm interested in what gets done with words. I'm interested in discourse. And as I had kind of tabled Julia Foote's book, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, I was just doing some other reading in the field of rhetoric. And I came across a book that was entitled, it's called A Guide for Interpreting Life Narratives. It is a book by Smith and Watson that provides a theoretical framing for understanding autobiographies. And while their interest was grounded in present day autobiographies, as I began to read it, I began to see some things in their writing that were applicable to this autobiographical piece that we get from Julia Foote. And within Smith and Watson's book, A Guide for Interpreting Life Narratives. In other words, when you see an autobiography, apart from the words, what is the discourse of an autobiography attempting to say? What are the things, plural, that an autobiography is attempting to say beyond the literate presence of words on the page? And so Smith and Watson answered it by saying that when you look at autobiography, that something is being said about memory. Something is being said about experience, encounters. Something is being said about one's identity. Something's being said about embodiment, how that author is embodying what they are writing about. And then I picked up on Smith and Watson's focus on audience and agency. I thought that audience and agency was a critical part of Julia Foote's narrative. Simple as that.
Great. You are watching Practical Conversations for the Life of the Church. Our guest tonight is the Reverend Dr. Richard Chapple, who has the lead article in the upcoming January edition of the Quarterly Review. The article is titled Julia Foote's A Brand Plucked from the Fire. It's an article based on her autobiography. And we're talking about Julia Foote's autobiography, but it's available if anyone would like to receive it. It can be found in a book entitled Sisters of the Spirit. It's published by Williams and Andrews. If you would go on to Amazon or any other site, you should be able to find this work. William Andrews, you should be able to find this work, and her autobiography is included within it. We're so happy to have you, Dr. Chapple. And we were discussing Reverend Foote and the beginnings of her ministry. Tell us about her calling and the troubles that she had with her husband.
I'm sure that there would be a number of women in ministry who might be able to relate to this. First of all, I think, as I read A Brand, I had a sense that in some ways Julia Foote would have been that strange kid in the posse on the block.
Hmm.
Smart, engaging, but maybe just a little kind of weird. And it appears that her ministry was stamped with that kind of skepticism toward her person. Called to ministry at a very young age. I think it was either 10 years old that she was first exposed to the faith, somewhere between 8 years old and 10 years old, that she was first exposed to the faith. I think around 15 years old, she then gave her life to the Lord, and shortly thereafter, she became preoccupied with learning to read.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted to learn to read because she wanted to read scripture. And so, as there was no Amazon books during that day to give, just a barrage of titles that she could choose from, of course she did, as we would think would be a custom for the day, and that is to focus on scripture. So she learned to read, and as she learned to read, she became concerned about acts of piety, helping others to learn to read, being kind to others. That began to morph into a yearning to do something more. I'm comfortable with doing that. I want to do that. I yearn to do that. But her autobiography situates us to understand that she felt that she wanted to do more. Bingo. That is a great religio, spiritual, and emotional location for one to experience a call to ministry. And
I guess we should stop here and locate her in terms of time. She was born in 1823 in
right,
upstate New York. So
right.
we're talking around the late 1830s, 1840s.
Mhm,
And not only is she a free woman, but at this time she's also encountering many runaways and
mhm.
ex-slaves in her life. So learning to read for her was an emancipating thing, or a liberating thing
Yes,
for her. So because it
yes,
opened so many doors for her.
yes.
Why don't you go on and continue?
Yes, 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 and in a moment, of course, we'll talk about her sense of agency and how
Hmm.
that sense of agency was attached to her being able to read. And in the larger cultural world at the time, though she be a free woman, the ability to read also positions her to have hopes, have dreams. It positions her to have a sense of agency that some whom she may have encountered, some that she may have encountered, may not have had, especially if they were runaway slaves. So Julia Foote receives this call to ministry. She writes well about it in her book. Um, uh, she receives this call to ministry as she is now married.
Hmm.
And her husband at first was supportive of her being saved and doing those acts of kindness. But when she crossed over and began to express that she experienced a call to ministry, as some of my sister girl friends in ministry would say, all hell broke loose in the househood. Or my very crass way of saying it, George did not want Jesus in the kitchen and in the bedroom.
Hmm.
And so he had a begrudging to a begrudging appreciation to no appreciation at all for her call to ministry, as well as her family, her mother.
Right.
Her mother even said to her, she talks about this in her book. She says that I would have preferred to receive notice that you were dead, as opposed to your having been in ministry. I mean, can you imagine the gut punch?
Yeah, from your own mother.
From your own mother. You know, a mother who prior to this encounter had been extremely supportive. Now, we have to say, thank God for grace, thank God for journey, and thank God that God can work through a vessel, and by using the vessel as God would use the vessel, God can change the mind of detractors who think you should not be doing what you understand God is calling you to do. Can the church say amen on that one?
You know, it was a very Victorian time. You know, yes. it to an extreme, the mentality was that a woman's place was in the home and in the kitchen.
Yes, very much.
You know, and here's Julia Foote saying, "I'm going to preach."
Yes, yes. Yes. And when she moved, when she married, they moved to Boston. And they were a part of the A.M.E. Zion Church in Boston. And John Beeman was the pastor. And John Beeman was like, nah, we ain't having this. And Julia Foote became ill, just a small illness, and Beeman came to visit her. And when Beeman came to visit her, he said to her, in essence, you don't know what you're talking about, and in time you're going to grow out of this. Because ain't nobody called you to preach. And the interesting thing about John Beeman is that John Beeman was a leading voice on the East Coast for the liberation of Black folk.
Mm-hmm.
And here comes a woman, and Beeman, in essence, says, yeah, I ain't talking about liberating you. I'm talking about liberating your husband.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll trust your husband to do for you what needs to be done. But I'm not talking to you. And Beeman, as much as uses the structures of the church punitively so that he could stop her ministry. And in essence, hear this. This is not language we use much in Methodism. Beeman excommunicated her from the church. He excommunicated her from.
Now, for the young preachers listening today, I want you to grasp this. You have a pastor so determined to stop your ministry that he goes as far as to excommunicate or to put you out of the church.
Yeah.
And this is in the 1840s, and we're talking about a woman who really has no rights, no way to turn.
Right.
You know, talk about the obstacles that she faced, encountering a pastor who would be so detrimental to her ministry.
Yeah. Interesting thing. There were those within the congregation who saw, this is the way that we would say it today, who saw that the Lord's hand was on her life.
Mm-hmm.
There were some who even encouraged her, look, since your relationship with the church is such a kind of a volatile and negating kind of relationship, why don't you rent out some space and do your own thing? and do your own thing, not in terms of forming a new society, but just gather some folk who want to hear you preach and who want to hear other preachers preach, not just women, but preachers in general. And there were three sisters, including Julia Foote, who said, "Oh, that sounds fine." So Julia Foote took the initiative, as they wanted her to find a space. She found a space. One of the ladies, she was so scared that she just dropped out of the trio. And then later, Beeman came at her again and said that you cannot do this. Now, let me pause. One of the reasons Julia Foote is not just of interest in ecclesial circles. The reason that ecclesial circles are now interested in Julia Foote is because academic circles picked up on her story. So in academia, Julia Foote is looked at because she becomes a representation of the 19th century woman's effort to, in essence, fight the powers. So in academic circles, if you want to see how women thought institutions and personalities that sought to demean, dehumanize, belittle, and negate their participation in the broader, more authority-laden aspects of society, academia said, here's one example, Julia Foote. And one of the things that I did when at Mother Zion, we bought Julia Foote the grave marker, I began to make calls around the country to let different historical societies know that we have bought her a marker. I thought that was an important piece of history, not just for the A.M.E. Zion Church. I thought it was an important piece of history for the world of intellectual inquiry, for the church world. And I also thought that it was important to buy her that marker to give a sister her just due, despite the fact it was so many years later. I wonder if Sister Girl shouting in heaven. I would like to think maybe so, maybe so.
You're watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. Tonight's guest is the Reverend Dr. Richard Chapple, whose lead article in the upcoming edition of the Quarterly Review is entitled Julia Foote, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, where he examines her autobiography, her life story, and gives us insights on not just her life and her ministry, but insights as to how we can have agency even today in our own selves. Reverend Chapple, we were talking about the obstacles that she faced as a woman in ministry in the middle 1800s, but she was liberated. That's my word. She was liberated by the death of her husband. Talk about what happens after her husband dies.
Julia Foote, she begins to travel. And not only does she begin to travel, well, she had always traveled. That was one of the ways that she gained the appreciation of the church world at the time, whether it be the A.M.E. Church, whether it be A.M.E. Zion circles, whether it be in Baptist circles, whether it would be in ecumenical camp meeting circles. Julia Foote, in essence, didn't need a church, didn't need a pastorate in order to do her thing. She was known as a gifted preacher, and that opened up the doors that she exercised.
She preached to several hundreds in camp meetings around the country.
Yes, yes. There are some who say that she preached to thousands.
Now, how do you do that without a microphone? That's just
you and I would know about that because of our Arkansas background. We would know how to squall without a microphone. God bless the folk at Holly Grove #2 in Portland,
Holly
Arkansas.
Grove #2. This is Arkansas talk, but go on.
Yeah. She begins to travel all the more and to travel freely. And this is a regrettable piece of information. And this is what I'm getting ready to share is always a part of the struggle of Blackness in the midst of Blackness, when Blackness is situated in a world of whiteness. Julia Foote, though appreciated by Black folk, was not as appreciated by Black folk as she was appreciated by white folk. Now, I'm from a theological generation where I don't need codes of whiteness for my self-affirmation. And I thank God to be a part of that generation. So I'm like you, Reggie, in the presence of whiteness, you'll never see me cowering. You'll never see me, yes, ma'am, and no, sir. You know, I'm in Alabama now, and one of the things that you learn in Alabama, it's a Southernism more than it is a racialized cultural affinity. It's saying yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. Well, down here, I don't say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir in certain cultural circles.
No.
Yeah, certain cultural circles. My point being that Julia Foote gained prominence most because of her fighting in Black Methodism and because of her preaching in white ecumenical circles. I mean, isn't that something? She's fighting, and her ability to fight gets her name in Black circles, but her ability to preach and stand on the wall is what gets her appreciation in white ecumenical circles. So to answer your question, you know, she began to preach and preach and preach and travel and travel and travel and travel. I'm glad that she was gifted and graced enough. I'm glad that she was discerning enough. I'm glad she had enough sense of agency to be able to negotiate both of those worlds and do what had to be done in those respective contexts. Sometimes in ministry, you have to fight for your affirmation.
Right.
But when you get through fighting, isn't it a good thing to be able to go and proclaim the word? Because our sense of calling is not to fight. Our sense of calling is to proclaim and to do ministry and to serve. And I'm just glad that she had the moxie. She had
Dr. Chapple, we have a question in the chat. Go ahead and put that up, Mr. Kent. Would you share on her challenging journey through the A.M.E. Zion Church process from the pew to her actual ordination?
Yeah, she doesn't talk about that much in her writing. What she talks about is that I was called to preach. As I was called to preach, I then experienced resistance. As I experienced resistance, I negotiated that resistance. And I came to terms with that resistance, knowing that I was not the only sister girl preacher out there who had detractors. So she doesn't say a lot about her journey. There's not a lot of writing on Julia Foote. For those who would be interested and who have that mindset, there are any number of other avenues for contribution with regard to writing about Julia Foote.
But within her autobiography, and we mentioned this earlier, there's a fluidity between her associations with Zion and with the A.M.Es. And in her autobiography, she mentions Daniel Payne, who would later become a bishop in the A.M.E. Church, calling her to come with him to engage in ministry. Can you talk about her sojourn in the A.M.E. Church?
Yeah. I don't know a lot about that. I don't know if it's my A.M.E. Zion versus A.M.E. sensibilities. I did have a lot of conversation with Leon Watts over the years.
Yes.
I have a certain kind of sensibility. I don't know intimately about her involvement, other than the fact of when she lived in certain places, it does appear that her default membership was first a part of the A.M.E. Church.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dr. Broadnax, you brought this to my awareness today when we communicated that it was the General A.M.E. General Conference's rejection of her.
Yes.
That motivated her aligning herself with the A.M.E. Zion community.
Yeah, she was recognized by certain personalities in the A.M.E. Church. I mentioned Daniel Payne, but within the A.M.E. Church, there was again this strong affirmation of male ministry to the detriment of female ministry. They were not in favor. As a matter of fact, the A.M.Es actually passed resolutions against females in ministry. Well, that sentiment did not exist in Zion. As a matter of fact, and I believe it's the 1878 General Conference that struck any reference to male out of its discipline. And when the General Conference struck references to males out of the discipline, it opened up a wide avenue for females and allowed Bishop Hood eventually to go forth and ordain her.
Yeah. Can you imagine the ecclesial strength that a Bishop Walters had to have had to ordain her as a deacon? The first. She's going to be the first. When I do this, she's going to be the first. I would love to hear what that discussion would have been like in cabinet. I would have loved to have heard the Holy Orders Committee's conversation, because while you had male ministers who did champion and push for women in ministry, remember, no one had yet been ordained.
None.
And not only was there none, you're talking about the masses of men having a begrudging appreciation for women in ministry. And this is the thing, again, I'm from a certain generation that was nurtured to think historically. Doing things out of a sense of history were important. And so I find my kind of ecclesial personality finds it difficult not to pay attention to doing religious things that bring with them a sense of history.
Yes.
And so I would have liked to have heard what that conversation would have been like. I would have loved to have heard Bishop Walters pray and work it out with the Lord as to what he was getting ready to do. Because I would imagine that there were some on the board who probably didn't want that.
All right. And let's set the context again for some who may have joined the conversation after we began. The A.M.Es were passing resolutions against women in ministry. The General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church stated strictly that women could not be ordained or even licensed into ministry. There was another white denomination, the Protestant Methodist Church, who in the late 1850s had ordained a woman, but the General Conference rescinded that ordination. So this is a climate not just within Black Methodism, this is a climate in Methodism in general, where women were not given, as it says, the gifts and graces afforded to them to practice in ministry. And here we are in 1895, I believe it was, where we come to a point of Reverend Julia Foote being ordained a deacon in the A.M.E. Zion Church.
Yeah. One of the discoveries that I made was this 19th century notion called the cult of true womanhood. The cult of true womanhood. It is a notion that was embodied in family, in religion, in education, in cultural institutions. It was a notion that was embodied to express that women should be pious, they should be submissive, and they, in essence, should look out for the goodwill of others within the confines of the social institutions that men made available to them, the family. And so in reading Julia Foote, we discover a personality, and I'll say it in the technical, this discourse that talks about women being narrowly conceived as human beings through this whole notion of the cult of true woman, the cult of true womanhood. With regard to her book and it being self-referential writing, an autobiography. One of the things that my research helped me to understand about self-referential writings, autobiographies, is that there's a certain character to them. On the one hand, self-referential writing is, and I just love this one, is a text of polemics. It is a taking on of a discourse and challenging that discourse, stretching that discourse, infusing that discourse with critiques and commentaries. So self-referential writing, autobiographies have this character where they are a polemical text. Also, they can be texts that offer ideas of progress. That person's life, as they talk about their life, share scenes from their life champions a certain idea of social progress that usually benefits more than just that particular person who is doing the writing. Something else about self-referential writing as a character is that the author is providing a representation of herself, of himself, that redresses how others talk about them.
Yes.
So if you want to get a sense of who I think I am and where I understand I am to be affirmed and where my merit is, read what I'm telling you about me. And man, I can imagine that took a lot of moxie from Sister Girl Julia to say, this is who you need to be speaking of. The other thing, something else that I discovered is that self-referential writing, and this would be of interest for me, it takes on these rhetorical moves within the writing that deconstructs and then constructs or reconstructs particular ideas that help to shape culture. So one of the things that Julia Foote is doing in this book is that she is telling stories. She's talking about how Black institutions are not supportive of women in ministry. She's talking about how Black family life is not supportive of women in ministry. She's looking at that. She's kind of whittling away at it. And then she's saying, at our best, this is what we should be doing with regard to women in ministry. So her writing, A Brand Plucked from the Fire, is not just an attempt to, in essence, say, I've made it, y'all. Listen to what I've done, which is, you know, part of the popular character of what it means to be good preacher nowadays. The preaching world is so affected by hip hop culture. When you make it, what you do is you flex on having made it. Julia Foote is trying to open the world of the church, as she's trying to open up the world of ministry for other sisters in ministry.
Mr. Kent, would you put up the book again? This is the book we're discussing, Sisters of the Spirit. Julia Foote's autobiography is published within this book. We had a question of giving examples of some of her sermons. Well, if you would get this book, she actually has a couple of her sermons actually outlined in her autobiography, and actually gives you the text of one of her sermons. So I would encourage you to get the book, read her autobiography, but you'll also get a sense of her preaching, and the strict holiness that she engaged in those days. I mean, I could not stand under such preaching today, but I really encourage you to get this book. Dr. Chapple, we have another question. Could you talk about the aftermath of her ordination and how that opened doors for women in Zion and across Black Methodism?
I've not read in that vein.
Okay.
I've not read in that vein, so I don't know what doors were actually opened. Again, my purpose was just to examine, put a particular critical lens on the book. So that is something that I'm unaware of, and now, it sounds like a great thing to explore.
I can't now. You know, I'm like you now. I'm about to have a junior senior moment. She is the first woman ordained a deacon, but the second woman ordained an elder. Bishop John B. Small's wife, and I think her name is Mary Smalls. Mary Smalls was ordained a deacon following Reverend Foote's ordination, and then ordained an elder ahead of Reverend Foote. But with those two, and Reverend Foote was also ordained an elder. But with those two ordinations, it became more acceptable, first within Zion, then within A.M.E, and finally CME circles, to ordain women. That is not to say that women had any less opposition to their ministries at the time with ordination, but having broken that barrier, it became more acceptable for women to receive ordination.
The A.M.E Zion Church had codified itself in history as being affirming of women in ministry, at least on paper.
At least on paper. Yes. In the few minutes that we have left,
I think
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's important to remember that Julia Foote had been doing ministry for years, and she was not ordained a deacon and then an elder until Sister Girl was old.
Yeah.
By the time the church went on to do it. And it would be interesting to explore why that was so. Why not ordain her when she was in her 40s, in her 50s? Why did they have to wait until she, in essence, was preparing herself for her homegoing to glory one day? That's interesting. You know, I say this, and I've always said this, that before the Black church is allowed to enter into heaven, the angels are going to require that the A.M.E. Zion Church march outside of heaven, either 7 days, 7 weeks, or 7 years, for the sins of patriarchy. Because how can I, as a Black man, say in a white religious world, respect me when I then come home and disrespect you because of gender? What is it in Western society that makes us find constructs that work to negate something about somebody? It's that intersection of race, class, and gender. One of the reasons that I don't like conservatism in any form, Black church, religion, politics, is because conservatism is always looking to exclude someone and to build a hierarchy. And even the A.M.E. Zion Church, as a middle-class church that comes out of aristocratic British culture, has a default move whereby it looks to structure hierarchies amid people. And
yes, and that is so, ironic, given that we are the Freedom Church.
yeah,
But that freedom seems to only exist for certain groups, certain classes of people, under certain conditions, with certain permissions. But let me not go into that. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to give you an opportunity to tell us just a little of her agency and how that can be helpful and informative for women who are struggling with the difficulties of ministry today.
Sure. Again, this whole notion of agency comes from Smith and Watson's book, A Guide for Interpreting Life Narratives. And as a methodology, what I did was I overlaid these theoretical constructs. I overlaid them and placed them on Julia Foote's writing. And what I discovered was that as Smith and Watson talk about self-referential writing affirms a sense of agency when looking at Julia Foote, what I discovered is that Julia Foote is always exercising agency. Exercising agency is a way of saying, I am fueled by the capacity within me that I identify to move beyond this place where I am.
Mm-hmm.
Agency is from within. Agency sees context. Agency sees obstacles, but there's something within me that looks out at the matrix and says, I don't belong within the matrix. And the way out of the matrix, or to negotiate a better positioning in the matrix, is left up to me. So when you think of agency in that regard, what you see is Julia Foote, in essence, is clapping back at at representations that others have of her. She's showing herself as someone who is gifted. She's showing herself as someone who's committed. Mm-hmm. She is showing herself as someone who had an encounter, a definitive encounter with the Lord of such merit that it drives her to pursue life in a certain kind of way. And she did it in a way that the Lord blessed it. Now, she, in essence, narrativizes her life. Mm-hmm. She strings different encounters and experiences in her life and says, I don't know what y'all talking about, but that stuff you are using to describe me, that ain't me. Let me help you understand who me is. This is me. And that's what she does in the brand. And, psychotherapy by training as well. So one of the things that we understand from those sciences, from those cultural contexts, is that one of the primary moves of being an adult is the move to discover and pursue your own sense of agency. Mm-hmm. In other words, you are not always comfortable with doing things that the crowd says that you can do. And anybody who has ever been engaged in ministry will always discover that there is always a tension between my sense of what God is doing with me and the institution mm-hmm. in which I work out that ministry. Mm-hmm. And as Methodist folk, we have several wonderful examples, and John Wesley is one of them. John Wesley would not make a good A.M.E. Zion pastor because John Wesley did not see himself as fitting within the matrix. I mean, he stayed within the Anglican Church, but he carved out a world of his own within the Anglican Church. And, he was willing to kind of struggle with it. And eventually, I guess they said, man, that dude crazy, man.
And for those of you who don't know, we are mad, but we have a method. They really did say that we were crazy.
Yeah, no doubt. And when you think in terms of our present struggles as a mainline Protestant Black church tradition, I wonder if it's time for us to rediscover our own sense of agency. Because what we're doing now, or maybe I should parse it and say a 21st century
sense of agency,
notion of agency. Because we have had a Bible sense of agency through the generations. But I think that with the way in which the world unfolds now, the particular cultural zeitgeist, all that kind of stuff that John Wesley would pay attention to, cultural mores, the rhetoric of society. I think that a part of the calling of mainline Protestantism today is to find its sense of 21st century agency. This is how I used to say it when I was blessed to pastor Mother Zion. Hey, y'all, what can John Wesley tell us about doing worship in 21st century Harlem? Am I going to pull from a worship model that is an 18th, 19th, 20th century model? I'm in Harlem. We're in Harlem, which speaks to a particular kind of culture or culturation that is levied against people. So again, my simple point is to say that I wonder if we can learn from Julia in discovering a new sense of agency for the 21st century, because it seems like at present, Reggie, Dr. Broadnax, this is my 47th year in ministry, man.
We have the same number.
My 47 year in ministry. So I've been watching us for a while.
Yeah, we've been watching it for a long time.
Yeah, it just seems that our sense of cultural agency is tied to a civil rights blackness that comes out of perhaps the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
70s, yeah.
And in some ways, not in all ways, in some ways, it's not working for us as previous senses of agency have done.
This is a good place for us. As we talk about Julia Foote and her sense of agency, and you mentioned having to redefine agency in the context of Harlem. Each of us, no matter where we are, my being in Durham, I see Dr. Mitchell is on, his being in Greensboro and others around the country, we have to define our own sense of agency within the context in which we do ministry. Yes. How can we do ministry in a way that pushes forward the movement and the will of God, and yet be true to who we are as ministers of the gospel? We are so thankful today to have as our guest the Reverend Dr. Richard Chapple, and to discuss the lead article in the upcoming January edition of the Quarterly Review, Julia Foote, a brand plucked from the fire. You've been watching Practical Conversations, Conversations for the Life of the Church. We're so happy to have had you to join us tonight, and we hope you would go out and get a copy of the Quarterly Review if you are not already a subscriber. Dr. Chapple, it has been a pleasure, sir, to have this conversation with you.
It's been my pleasure. It's been my pleasure. And I'm excited that you are the editor. As there was the need for another editor, I am glad that you are the editor of the Quarterly Review. Man, that's you.
Well, thank you, sir. I so appreciate your compliment, and our friendship goes back many years. We thank you tonight for joining us for Practical Conversations for the Life of the Church. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.